So let's go over what we're going to cover in this module. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to answer the question of what is a class. We're going to define from a very high level what a class is and try to really understand what a class is in object-oriented programming and specifically in Java. Then we're going to take our understanding of a class and we're going to use that to define an object. We're going to see what the difference between an object and a class is, because this is a really important distinction that you need to be able to make in Java. A lot of people get confused between a class and an object, and I really want to clear this up so that we have a good solid understanding to build from. Then we'll talk about how to make up a class, which is to use members. We'll talk about how members are the data and the methods that operate on a class, the data and then the way to manipulate that data, and how that is tightly bound together in a class. Then I'll show you some examples of how to use a class. We'll create a class and we'll create some members for that class, and then we'll see how we can create an object from that class. Then we'll talk about how to create methods and what a method is. I'll show you how to create a method on your class and the different kinds of methods that you can use in a class in order to manipulate the data in the class or to access that data. Then we'll get into some constructors. As we create our class in Java, we'll find that we need some way to initialize that class or to set its default values or to set some values on that class so that the object that gets created from that class can be used. And I'll show you how to do that by using constructors. Then finally, we'll get into access modifiers, which will allow us the capability to hide data in our class or to make it visible. So let's answer that question that many of you may be having, is what is a class? Well, to put it really simply, it's a way that we classify things in Java. And you see all these printers that I have on this slide. The printers are a good example of something that we already do in normal day-to-day life that is very much like a class in Java, which is we have a large number of printers that exist in the world. They have all kinds of different attributes, whether they have a duplexer or different paper sizes that they will print on, or color, or black and white, or model numbers, or manufacturers. But we typically would just say, hey, I want to buy a printer, or I have a printer. We don't necessarily go down to all of the details. And when we talk about a printer, someone understands what we mean. They understand the general idea of what a printer is. We don't have to tell them exactly what the attributes are for someone to understand that we're talking about a printer. And when we try to build a printer, we generally know what a printer needs to do. There's certain things that all printers have in common, and that is kind of a classification, and that's really what a class embodies in an object-oriented programming language. It's a way that we're trying to take something, a lot of times from the real world, but in today's object-oriented thinking, it's not always from the real world. What it's more of is a set of responsibilities and some data that we are grouping together to classify something so that we can create instances of that thing and have the data vary. We're basically taking out what is constant about a thing and using a name for it so we can identify that. And so with the printer example, if you think about it, when we say printer, well, what are some of the common things about a printer? You think that it has a paper feed, it has cartridges, depending on what kind of printer it is, but it has some ability to print, some kind of printing engine. It usually has an on and off switch. These are the kind of things that all printers have. So when we're thinking about a class in Java, it's really just a structure to define this classification of a thing. And so now let's look at a little bit more of a technical explanation of what a class is in Java. Basically, a class is methods and data. And what I mean by that is data, of course, is things, attributes like a model number or a serial number or a paper capacity. It's data that can change about a printer. Different printers might have different data. And methods are actions, are things that can be done with a printer or on that data. So a class is a way that we're going to group together this related set of actions or things that manipulate data and the data itself. And that's really the key. You can use a class in a different way than that, but the real reason for creating a class and a thing that makes a good class is how tightly bound together the methods or the actions and the data are. You want to put them together so that they perform as one action. And so a class, basically, another way of thinking about this, is a blueprint for creating an object. So up to this point we hadn't talked about objects, and we're going to talk about objects a little bit more later, but basically a class is going to act as a blueprint, or you can see here I've got another example, is cookie cutter. And that class is going to be the mold or the design that's going to allow you to create this other object that's more specific. So when we think about this in terms of the printer, if I said I have a class called printer, well, that's not very specific. But you want to be able to create something specific. And what you want to know when you create something specific is the important details, the things that make printers different. So what are the things that make different printers different, and what things are the same? The methods and data that are common to all printers, and that's part of the class. And then when we talk about what makes them different, that's going to be where we get into the objects. And what a class is doing is it's allowing you to specify what are the general characteristics of a printer so that you could actually create a printer in your code. So another way to look at a class, getting even more into the technical details of what a class is in Java, is it's a type. A class is a non-primitive type. So what I mean by that is we had covered primitive types before, integers, the decimal representations of floats and doubles, and a Boolean, characters. A class is none of those. What a class is it's basically a type that you create, or that is created even by the Java class library. But typically when you're using classes or you create a class, you're basically creating a type. So if you declare a variable can be of, instead of a type we did integer x equals 3, you can have your type or your class be that type. So if you create a printer class, you might have printer x equals, and then you would create a new printer. So there's a way that we can think about this also, of why do we have a class and how does this whole type system and classes work together. And that is basically, if you think about that in Java, everything is eventually made up of primitive types. You have to have everything that exists in Java, in a Java programming language, at some root of it is a primitive type, an integer, a character, a decimal. And a class is just composed of those primitive types and then some methods to work with that data. So when you think about it, what you're doing with a class is you're herding complexity. You're taking something that's complex. You could take any Java program, you could get rid of all of the classes, and you could just use primitive types and not group them together. It'd be really hard to understand that program because it'd be very complex. But you could do that. And if you think about the contrast of that, what we're doing with the class is we're taking that complexity, we're grouping it into roles and responsibilities, data that belongs together, and methods that work with that data, and that is really what we're doing when we're creating a class. Now that we've talked about what a class is, let's define an object kind of in terms of a class. So what is an object? The simple definition is it is an instance of a class. And what I mean by an instance is, if a class is a blueprint, an object is a house. It's a thing that you build with the blueprint. If a class is a cookie cutter, an object is the cookie. So if you think about it that way, the class kind of set these parameters. With our printer example, the class was a printer. The object is a very specific printer. It is your printer that is in your house, sitting on your desk, with the model number, a serial number, all of these attributes. It's no longer this intangible thing. A class is intangible. An object is a real thing. It's an instance of a class. It was made by the blueprint, the mold, that the class provided you. So another way to think about this is a purchase in a store. Now, if you went to a store and you said, I want some candy, well, that's not an object. Not candy. Candy is a class. If you just said, I want candy, the person selling the candy might say, you need to be more specific than that. I want a specific type of candy. Well, that's still not even good enough of a definition. That's still a class, because you might have this idea of, I want a candy bar, or I want a Hershey's bar. You can't buy this concept. You can't just buy candy, or you can't just buy a Hershey's bar. You have to buy a specific actual candy bar. So if you're really going to the store to buy candy, you would pick up a candy bar, you'd put that on the counter, and you'd buy that, and that is an object. And so when you think about it that way, that's how you can really separate a class from an object. A class is the idea. An object is the actual real thing. And when we're talking in code, it becomes a little more blurry because, of course, everything is in memory. But the real way to think about it is you can kind of run through that test and say, is this thing something specific, an exact, one-of-a-kind, unique thing, an instance, or idea?